Welcome to the live stream from the second online weekend of Climate Assembly UK. This weekend, the Assembly is considering the topic of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. The Assembly is going to hear from 5 speakers, and on the live stream, you'll be able to hear 4 of them. And I'm going to explain why you can't hear the 5th speaker in a second. So the first speaker today is Professor Rebecca Willis from the University of Lancaster, and she's one of our expert leads. Becky will be explaining why the Assembly is looking at the topic of greenhouse gas removals and introducing the panel. Our second speaker is Chris Stark from the Committee on Climate Change, who's also one of the Assembly's expert leads. Chris is speaking as what we call an informant. That means he's presenting the balance of evidence that exists on the issue rather than his personal opinion. Chris is going to be covering 6 different ways of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. After Chris, we have 2 speakers who are what are known as advocates, or what we call advocates. They're people who are going to give their personal opinion on this topic. So they're going to give their personal opinion on which of the ways of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere are their preferred methods, and also on how much the UK should be relying on greenhouse gas removals. Those 2 speakers are Dr. Douglas Parr from Greenpeace and Bill Spence. Now, if you Google Bill, you'll see he formerly worked at Shell, but today he is speaking as an independent. And he starts his presentation by saying a little bit more about his professional background. Now, after Bill, that's where the live stream that you'll be able to watch will end. But the Assembly will hear from one more speaker. And that speaker is Professor Jim Watson from University College London's Institute of Sustainable Resources. Jim is also one of our expert leads. And what Jim's going to do is present to the Assembly the results of some of the votes and draft decisions that they've taken so far at earlier weekends. The reason he's going to do that is that some of those draft decisions have implications for what the Assembly might decide this weekend about greenhouse gas removals. We're not live streaming that talk because we're not releasing the Assembly's draft decisions, only the final ones in the final report when all the results are ready. So that's why you can't hear Jim's presentation. As with the first online weekend, you're going to hear exactly the same information from the speakers that the Assembly hears at the same time that the Assembly hears it. But also, as at the first weekend, these are pre-records. So we pre-recorded these talks in case the speakers became ill given the current situation, or in case they had technical problems, internet problems that prevented them from talking to the Assembly. So you're hearing exactly the same thing as the Assembly, but it is pre-recorded. Moving on to our first speaker then. This is the introduction to the panel from Professor Rebecca Willis.
Hello and welcome to another online session. Today we're going to be looking at ways of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. This is something that we've talked about through the course of the Assembly, but we haven't focused on it directly. So I'm going to recap why we need greenhouse gas removals and then tell you about the speakers you'll hear from. Moving on to slide 2. So why do we need to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere? You might remember this diagram. As you know, over the next 30 years, we need to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases by a very large amount by, for example, changing the way we travel, the way we generate electricity, and how we heat our homes. It's far better and cheaper to reduce the amount of carbon entering the atmosphere than to remove it once it's there. We need to get as close to zero as we can. But there will always be some greenhouse gas emissions that we can't avoid. For example, there are currently no alternatives to carbon-emitting plane engines, and some greenhouse gas emissions from farming are very hard to avoid. So for those emissions that we can't avoid, we need to take the same amount of emissions out of the atmosphere. And today we're going to be talking in more detail about the different ways of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And then we're going to ask you to discuss and decide your recommendations. Moving on to slide 3. First of all, you're going to hear from Chris, who heads up the Committee on Climate Change, which advises government. Chris is also an expert lead for the Assembly. He'll be speaking as an informant, explaining the 6 main ways of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and talking about the advantages and disadvantages of each. Those 6 ways are, firstly, forests and better forest management. Secondly, peatlands and wetlands. Thirdly, enhancing the storage of carbon in soil. Fourthly, using wood in construction. Fifthly, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, often called BECCS. And lastly, direct air capture and carbon storage. I'm not going to explain any of those now, I'll leave that to Chris. But we haven't included every possible greenhouse gas removal technology. We focused on the ones most likely to make a significant contribution to the UK's target. Moving on to slide 4. After that, you'll hear two differing views on which of the methods Chris outlined are best and how much we should rely on greenhouse gas removals. These speakers are both speaking as advocates. They are Dr. Douglas Parr from Greenpeace and Bill Spence, who's independent. Again, I'll leave them to explain their views rather than second guessing them. Moving on to slide 5. Lastly, you'll hear from Jim Watson, another of our expert leads. He's going to tell you about some of the decisions that the Assembly has already made and the results of some of the votes you cast on our last weekend in Birmingham. This is because there are some areas that have been discussed by the Assembly where greenhouse gas removals will be required. These are emissions from air travel and emissions from food, farming and land use. Jim will talk about the decisions you've already made and what that means for the decisions you might make now about greenhouse gas removals. For those of you who aren't Assembly members but are listening in on the live stream, I'm afraid we can't live stream Jim's talk as we're not releasing the outcomes of the votes just yet. Assembly members, this afternoon you'll get a chance to question Chris, Doug and Bill. Then tomorrow you'll discuss what you've heard in smaller groups before voting. In the votes, you'll be asked how much you agree or disagree that each of these ways of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere should be part of how the UK gets to net zero. And you'll be asked to rank them in order of preference. There will also be space, if you want to add any other views you have on removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere that you'd like us to capture for the Assembly report. So that's all from me, and I'll hand back to Sarah now. Thanks.
So we'll now move on to our second presentation, which is from Chris Stark from the Committee on Climate Change.
Hi again, everyone. Joining you virtually this time, but nice to see you all, and we'll have the chance to speak later on. I'm going to talk to you today about one of the most important topics for net zero, and that's greenhouse gas removals. So today we're going to do an introduction into how we can actually remove a greenhouse gas like carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere, and how we can then store that carbon safely so it doesn't cause climate change. Throughout this talk, I'll be referring to methods that remove carbon dioxide from the air. There are other greenhouse gases, but there's less of them in the atmosphere, so they're more difficult to remove. So for the whole of this talk, we're talking about carbon dioxide and carbon. So I'm going to run through 6 of the main greenhouse gas removal methods. I'm going to talk about their status and their potential and try and explain some of their pros and cons. Now, the pros and the cons I'll cover are examples. They're not supposed to be comprehensive, so we can always cover more detailed questions in the Q&A. There are other methods, and I want to be clear about that. The other methods, though, are more speculative at the moment. And what I mean by that is that we need to do work to allow us to understand how they could be used at scale, and especially to ensure that the risks associated with those other methods can be managed properly. Because of all that, we felt it was important to understand what you thought as an Assembly about the main contenders for greenhouse gas removal. So I'm only going to focus on 6 methods today. So let's move on to slide 2. The first method I want to talk about is growing forests and woodland. And probably this is the simplest of the removal methods. When trees grow, they naturally absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It takes a forest about 10 years to ramp up to the maximum amount of carbon it can store. After between 20 and 100 years, the forest reaches what we call maturity, when the amount of carbon it absorbs starts to slow down. Now, we can grow more forests and woodlands, and we can also manage forests better to maximise the amount of carbon they store. So a forester can remove some of the young tree growth to make room for other trees to grow more successfully, and that allows us to increase the overall amount of carbon that's stored in that forest. Moving on to slide 3. If that's what can be done with forests and woodlands, what are the potential advantages and disadvantages of doing greenhouse gas removals in that way? Well, the costs are low. We understand very well indeed the potential to store carbon through that route, and we think it's possible to store a lot of carbon dioxide and lock that away in forests for a long time. But some of the cons are it does take time for trees to grow and to mature, at least 10 years. The land that we use could be used for other activities, and especially growing food. So Jim is actually going to talk to you about what the group looking at food and farming and land use thought about and discussed in Birmingham a bit later on. It could also have a negative impact on what we call biodiversity. So nature is another way of looking at that. So if we grow those trees, the wrong trees in the wrong places, then that can have a damaging impact on nature. Let's move on to slide 4. The second method I want to talk about is peatlands and wetlands. Just like forests, this is another natural way of doing greenhouse gas removals. Peatlands and wetlands are the damp, wet, natural habitats that you find all around the UK. These are places that naturally store a lot of carbon, but interestingly, if they dry out, they can actually release that carbon back into the atmosphere. So if we want to use these habitats as a way of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, then we need to keep them wet. And often that means restoring those peatlands and wetlands to what they had been before agricultural practices deliberately dried them out to create farmland. Moving on to slide 5. So some of the potential advantages and disadvantages of doing greenhouse gas removals in this way. We know a lot about how to restore peatlands and wetlands. It's a quick way to store carbon, and it can be relatively low cost. And there are a set of other wider environmental benefits that come from having these restored natural habitats. On the con side, disadvantages are we understand less about whether we can safely store carbon in these places for a long time, and especially when climate change may warm the planet. So we run the risk of releasing some of that carbon again in the future. It uses up land that might be used for something else, especially agricultural land, farming. And there's only limited potential. So there's only some areas of the UK that are suitable to be restored in that way. So moving on to slide 6. So the next method I'm going to talk about is enhancing the storage of carbon in the soil. And again, as with forests and with peatlands and wetlands, this is a natural way to store carbon. How much carbon we can store in the soil is affected by a few things, and especially how we farm on that soil. So firstly, how often we disturb the soil, and especially ploughing it with machines. And secondly, how much organic material is in the soil. Now, organic material is things that were once living, like plants, but are now dead. So those of you who have gardens might have a compost heap where you put your garden waste. If you let that decay a bit and then dig it back into the soil, that's the organic material I'm talking about. If we want the soil to be able to store more carbon, we need to disturb it less and ensure it has more organic material in it. And that's really about changing farming practices. So changing the way that crops are grown is one way to do it, reducing how often we plough the soil with machines, and using natural fertilizers rather than the artificial chemical fertilizers that are often used. Moving on then to slide 7. These are some of the potential advantages and disadvantages of storing carbon in the soil in that way. It's a very well understood method, so we can get cracking on that now. And it does have a low cost for those that do it. And there are other wider benefits, especially to the environment, if we treat the soils in that way. On the disadvantages side, It does require a change to modern recent farming practice. Farmers might need some support to make that kind of change. And it can reduce the amount of food that can be produced from a given area of land, the yield of that land. Slide 8 is the simplest of these, really something I'm sure you will be familiar with, and that's using wood when we build and construct buildings. Very simply, this is a method where we grow a tree. As it grows, it absorbs the carbon from the atmosphere. We then cut that tree down for timber. Hopefully, we plant a new tree to replace it when we do that. And we use the timber in the construction of a house or another building. And that building is a safe store of carbon for often many hundreds of years, and at least until the house is knocked down or the timber is burned. So it's a good way of storing carbon if we can use more wood in the building of a house. Moving on to slide 9. So why might using wood in construction be a good idea? Why might it not be a good idea? Well, wood has been something we've understood and used for centuries in constructing buildings. It's a relatively low-cost way to store carbon, and it reduces our carbon emissions by replacing other much more carbon-intensive materials like concrete and brick. On the disadvantage side, it does require a change to the modern building practices that are typically used. It might mean that some very tall buildings aren't possible, so you can't use timber for some of the tallest buildings. And the scale of this as a method is limited by, of course, the availability of the wood to supply it from sustainable sources. Moving on to slide 10. Now, this is one of the most promising of the technological options, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Also one of the options that many people are quite concerned about, so I'm going to spend a bit of time on this one. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage involves a number of processes, some of which you've already discussed at the assembly. I'm going to talk you through the stages of it. So first, what we call the biomass is grown. Now, biomass just means a plant. So it grows and it absorbs carbon as it does so. In this example, the biomass is a tree. So we grow a forest. Some smaller trees might be removed by the forester to allow more successful trees to grow even larger. This is a byproduct of good forest management. Sometimes we call that forest thinnings. And those thinnings are a supply of biomass which you can then use to produce energy. So in the simplest example, we burn that wood to generate electricity. That's very helpful, but it also produces carbon dioxide. So we need to capture as much of that carbon dioxide as we can. And we do that through an industrial process, which is represented here with a big grey tower with the clouds above it. We haven't yet found a way to capture 100% or all of the carbon dioxide that's produced when we burn wood like this, when we burn biomass like this. So some will escape into the atmosphere, and that's one of the criticisms of this approach. But we do know how to capture most of it. So in the future, there might be technology that improves the amount that we can capture to even higher rates of the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide that is captured then needs to be stored somewhere. So we can pipe that to a safe storage destination underground. In the UK, some of the best locations are where we once found oil and gas in the seas, in the North Sea, for example. It goes underground through a relatively quick geological process to effectively turn that back into rock. So it should be quite a low risk of leaking when it's under the sea. Let's move on to slide 11. So the main advantage of this is that we can capture and we can store a large amount of carbon dioxide emissions. It combines technologies that we understand, and there is lots and lots of storage space for that carbon in the UK, especially in the depleted, the old oil and gas fields that we have in the seas around the UK. On the disadvantage side, though, it's likely to have high costs, at least initially. And we need land to grow the biomass, so that uses land that could be used for other activities. And we also need to ensure and be clear that the carbon that is stored is in a place that is secure and won't be released. Let's then move on to slide 12. And the final method I'm going to talk to you about today is direct air capture with carbon storage. And this is one of the newest technologies for greenhouse gas removal. And here, a machine actually sucks the air and passes it over a carbon-absorbing material or a chemical, which then separates that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, taking it out of the atmosphere and reducing the impact that it has on climate change. This is an interesting approach because we don't actually need to grow a plant to capture the carbon. Going through that process creates a supply of carbon dioxide, which we then need to transport to safe storage underground, just as we did with the previous method. So moving on then to slide 13. And these are some of the potential advantages and disadvantages of doing greenhouse gas removals in this way. We can capture and store a significant amount of carbon dioxide emissions doing this. There's lots of storage space in the UK, in particular in the old oil and gas fields. And there are a variety of technical options that are being developed to try and do this in the future. Disadvantages are that it's still very new and therefore quite an experimental technology. It might require a very large amount of low carbon electricity, so to plug these things in to make sure they work. And current costs and current projections for costs are still very high, though of course they might fall as the technology improves. So that concludes my introduction to some of the greenhouse gas removal methods. I hope I could explain what's often quite a tricky set of concepts, and I'll obviously be available later to answer questions on it as best I can. For now, thanks very much.
We'll now move on to our third presentation, which is from Dr. Douglas Parr of Greenpeace.
Well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to present to you about my views on greenhouse gas removal technology. As you know, my name's Doug Parr. I'm from Greenpeace UK. I'm Policy Director there. And my presentation is about being wary about how much greenhouse gas removal technology will save us and about the issues that some of them have. The key points that I want to make, moving on to slide 2, is that at the moment greenhouse gas removal technologies are unproven and uncosted, so we don't know how much we're going to be able to take out of the atmosphere in a meaningful way. None of the options is actually perfect. Now, I'll explain why I prefer some to others, but none of them is actually perfect, and so it's really important that we lower actual emissions. And what I mean by emissions reductions is the sort of thing that you've been looking at over the last few weeks, like reducing the amount of petrol and diesel used in cars, reducing the amount of gas used in heating, and so on. So all the things that are contributing to lowering emissions across the piece. And there are some greenhouse gas removal technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture, BECCS, that I'm worried about having serious impacts on nature and on land, and may not even work. And the other point is that the belief that greenhouse gas removal technologies will be cheap and deliverable can affect how we behave today and may mean we don't do the necessary things that we need to do to make sure that we're on track to hitting net zero. Moving on to slide 3. So just to run over some thoughts about the options that you'll have heard about from Chris. As I emphasise, no option is perfect, but I believe that nature-based solutions like forests, like peat restoration, soil enhancement, can be win-win. In other words, they can be done well, and they can help nature, and they can help carbon removal if they're done well. But this is an if. And what that really means is that government has to be strong to make sure that we do remove the carbon that we say we're going to remove, and we don't trash nature in the process. I would argue that a nature-first approach to these kind of approaches is good, and then we can get those win-wins. I have questions, and in fact don't really like the prospect of bioenergy with carbon capture. I also have questions, although I wouldn't be kind of firmly opposed to direct air capture and storage. So the thing about BECCS and about direct air capture is that they both need this technology called carbon capture and storage. This is on slide 4, sorry. The thing about that is that carbon capture and storage has been debated for over 20 years. I remember being in Greenpeace in the late 90s talking about what we thought about it. Was it all right? Was it not too good? That's over 20 years ago, and we still haven't got a fully fledged project. The costs remain very uncertain, and yet so we shouldn't really be relying on it as the way to deliver negative emissions. Carbon capture requires more fuel than we currently use if it's applied to industrial processes. For example, a fifth more is needed in power stations. And there are other questions about whether there are enough suitable sites across the world, how well it will be regulated, not just in the UK, but in other countries, the possibilities of leakage. And we know that there's been opposition to projects going ahead in countries, certainly within Europe. So moving on to slide 5 about the threats from BECCS, that's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Here's a quote from the Royal Institute on International Affairs, also known as Chatham House, important international think tank based in London, where they say that the deployment of BECCS at the scales assumed in most climate models would consume land on a scale comparable to half that currently taken up by global cropland, entailing massive land use change, potentially endangering food security and biodiversity. Food security is the ability of people and populations to ensure they have quality food, enough food, and at a reasonable cost. So it does endanger potentially it's going to endanger the ability of people to access food. And so what that is saying is that when models are done about the climate, energy, and land system together, and the numbers are crunched by scientists, the scale of what is needed from BECCS to deliver on emissions reductions is very large indeed, and could endanger both food security and biodiversity because of the amount of land that they actually need, which is half of the existing global cropland. Moving on to slide 6, there's another distinguished grouping called the European Academy Science Advisory Council, and they say that there remain substantial risks and uncertainties associated with BECCS and its environmental impact, and indeed its ability to achieve a net removal of greenhouse gases, and that we shouldn't be relying on BECCS for delivering these things when they might not actually be delivered in practice. Now, why might BECCS not actually work? That's on slide 7 now. Well, first of all, if you have land and you just leave it, it absorbs carbon dioxide. It just does as stuff grows. So we need to take that into account. And is it actually better, which it might be in some instances, just to leave the land alone and it will absorb more carbon than BECCS might? Now, in processing the bioenergy for use within a BECCS system, there are also emissions from soil damage, from transport, from processing, getting hold of the bioenergy, and that reduces the impact of the removals, the overall removals that come from the BECCS process. And there are even more risks, because if we convert land to use for bioenergy, and remember that earlier quote saying we'd have to find land equivalent to half of global cropland, well, what happens to the crops that were grown on that land? If we're converting cropland, then crops will have to be grown somewhere else. And we know from our existing experience with biofuels that actually what that means is those crops are grown elsewhere, and they're grown where forests have been chopped down in order to grow them. And that has massive implications both for nature and for climate. So there are serious questions about whether BECCS is going to be effective. So let's just say something a little bit about tree planting. This is on slide 8. As I've said, trees are good. I'm part of my local tree group. We go around planting trees. They're really good, but they're quite different from emissions reductions, and they're not any kind of substitute. And what I mean by emissions reductions is the sort of thing that you've been looking at over the last few weeks, like reducing the amount of petrol and diesel used in cars, reducing the amount of gas used in heating, and so on. So all the things that are contributing to lowering emissions across the piece. And one of the key reasons for that is that if we have carbon stored in trees, it's not the same as carbon stored under the ground, because eventually we know that forests, trees, they will become part of the natural landscape, and some of that carbon will be released from things like forest fires and when trees get diseased. And the way we actually go about dealing with tree planting leaves a lot to be desired. It's through a process quite often called offsets, and offsets often don't work. Some analysis of the official offsetting process done under international climate talks showed that only about 1 in 7 projects actually added to the carbon being taken out of the atmosphere. In some instances, things like carbon credits, as they're known for these offsets, don't actually lead to the planting of more trees. There's an example of that from a petrol company in the UK, where the trees that they are saying are being planted, if you buy these, you top up a little bit on your on the price of a litre of petrol, doesn't actually lead to more trees being planted, because what they're doing is paying people who planted trees before 2008. That's not really adding to carbon removals. It's just an accounting device. Moving on to slide 9. So one of the most risky things about greenhouse gas removals is that they end up deferring action now. As you've been looking at all the things that we need to do, I'm sure you've realized that getting to zero emissions is quite hard, and some of it might require some unpopular action in the short term. And the prospect of greenhouse gas removal technologies might seem quite appealing. It leads to something that's known, or academics have described as the attraction of delay. So even though we don't know whether these things are going to be working, the prospect of them possibly being there can allow politicians to say, oh, well, maybe we don't need to do this unpopular stuff now. We can leave it because we can have greenhouse gas removal later. And I've already seen this with a senior politician actually avoiding hard questions about reducing demand for flying by saying, oh, well, there'll be all these future technologies. Of course, we don't need to stop flying. So moving on to my final slide, slide 10, just to reiterate those key points. Greenhouse gas removal technologies remain unproven and uncosted. And although nothing is perfect, I prefer the nature-based solutions, but it's really, really important to lower actual emissions and not to think that somehow greenhouse gas removal is going to save us. I've run over some of the serious issues that are associated with bioenergy, with carbon capture, and the impacts on nature and land. And also I'd reiterate that there's a belief that greenhouse gas removals could be cheap and deliverable, can lead to delay in taking the critical action necessary, even though, as we know, they're unproven and uncosted and may not actually help us that much in the end. Thank you very much.
We'll now move on to our 4th presentation, which is from Bill Spence, who is speaking as an independent.
Thank you, Sarah, and I'm delighted to be here with the opportunity to speak to the Climate Assembly. I am Bill Spence. I'm going to speak to you about greenhouse gas removal, particularly being positive about going negative. I am an engineer. I've been an engineer for the past 36 years, and for about half of my career, I focused on trying to find and bring oil and gas out of the subsurface into the atmosphere. About midway in my career, I realized the problem I was creating, and I switched to learning how to identify that CO2 captured and put it back underground. So I feel particularly adept at sharing with you both the emissions and the capture side of this technology. So let me take you to slide number 2 with an overview of my presentation. So I will give a brief summary of why we need to do greenhouse gas removals, what nature has done in past history to safely remove greenhouse gas, take you on to how much removal we need to do and the cost involved, and then a quick overview with my conclusions. Take you to slide 3. So why do we need to do removals? Well, we're on the verge of filling our atmosphere with more CO2 than is safe for mankind. Our atmosphere is incredibly thin, and if in the next 30 years, by 2050, we want to get to net zero, we need to slow the release of CO2 and launch a concerted effort of greenhouse gas removals to result in net zero. So it isn't an either or, we've got to do both, slow the emissions and increase the net removals. Let me take you to slide number 4, where we go through what nature has done. I would like to make the point that nature has done this safely before, and I take you back 65 million years to when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. When the dinosaurs were here, CO2 levels were 5 times higher than they were today. So nature has figured out how to bring those levels down, and it's used 2 key routes. Nature removes CO2 from the atmosphere using trees and creating rocks. So if I explore the tree side, the trees act to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and turn it into plants. Those plants in due course will break down and become soil or peat, and that in some cases became buried. When it became buried and covered into the deep subsurface, it became coal and oil and gas. On the flip side, we see it can also create rocks. CO2 comes out of the atmosphere to make rocks, as we see in the Atlas Mountains in North Africa, the Rockies in Canada, the White Cliffs of Dover here in the UK. Both of these routes offer safe, long-term, proven storage. The only issue is that nature has had 65 million years to bring these levels down, and we need to do this 1 million times faster. So what we're fortunate to have is we've got a number of scientists and burgeoning businesses that are already learning how to do this 1 million times faster. And I take you to slide 5, where I look at what really can be done at scale and speed based on how nature has done it in the past. So starting with tree-based and going to the rock-based ones, these squares that have now appeared on your screen represent the scale of capture and storage, greenhouse gas removal that can be done by various methods. The first is BECCS, bioenergy plus CCS, and we heard Chris talk about that earlier. This is using plants to absorb the CO2. We then take those plants, burn them down, and the CO2 goes deep underground, but allowing us to use the energy that those plants have stored from the sun. We can do something in the order of 50 to 100 million tons of CO2 per year using BECCS. The second option, the second biggest square, is using forest, soil, and wood in construction. So instead of taking all the CO2 and putting it deep underground, what we learned to do is use that carbon-based material at the surface to make sure our soils continuously get better, our forests get bigger, and we see more and more wood structures that store the CO2. That has something in the order of 10 million tons of CO2 per year potential. Going down another scale is the idea of direct air capture. And this is where mankind has, in essence, simulated a tree, a device which is able to pick the CO2 out of the atmosphere, capture it just as a tree would, capture it, and then we put it deep underground. Smaller again at 1 to 5 million tons of CO2 per year through direct air capture. And the fourth option is the one turning it into rock. Now we see it has the smallest potential at present. Enhanced weathering is one of those options. That has something at present in the order of 1 million tons of CO2 per year. So this is our current projection of where we'll be in 2050. Now the question is, with these options, just how much do we need to do if this is how much we can do? And I take you to slide 6. Here I use a little needle gauge to show where I think we're going to be in our best case. The best case being that we only need to tidy up after airplanes, or aviation, and agriculture. So I'm assuming everybody else has done their job, and all that's left to tidy up is aviation and agriculture. So greenhouse gas removal isn't an excuse for inaction, it is for those difficult sectors. And we're looking at something in the order of 50 million tons of CO2 per year as our best case. So delivering 50 million tons per year will be a challenge, but it's doable. And what's important is to understand the cost involved in doing this cleanup of the last 50 million tons. And I show a small box to the top right, where you look at the greenhouse gas removal cost. To do this last 50 million tons, to tidy up from aviation and agriculture, we're going to spend something in the order of 10 billion pounds per annum. Now, if I wind back and we look at the entire budget to get to net zero of replacing the automotive fleet, tidying up industry, agriculture, power, all of that cost about 1/3 of that, 33% of that will need to go to tidy up this last bit during greenhouse gas removals. So it is an expensive option, but the last bit is always the most expensive. So from here, I will take you to slide 7. So if we are to deliver 50 million tons of CO2 removal in any given year, it's my opinion that we're going to need about 3/4, 75% of that, to be done with BECCS, biomass plus CCS, and the other 25% to be done by increasing forest areas, capturing more CO2 in the soils, using wood in construction, utilizing technologies like direct air capture with storage, and enhanced weathering. So the combination of about 3/4 BECCS, 1/4 the other options in order to meet the greenhouse reductions we need. And I'll take you to slide number 8. It gives us a summary of where we will be in the event that many of the sectors, many of the parts of our economy don't clean up as much as they should. And I show across the bottom a number of little icons. If we say that not just planes and agriculture fail to get to zero, if buildings, industry, power, shipping, and automotive fail to get there, we end up in a maximum case. And I show my little needle gauge into the red at 90 million tons of CO2 per year. And that's because we're really starting to bump up against the limits of what we can do with carbon capture and storage, what we can do with biomass and tree availability. All of these things starting to bump up against the limits of what we can do. So it's important that we don't leave ourselves in this position where we're having to tidy up after a number of parts of the economy don't do their job. Now, at this point, I need to make it very clear, as I go to slide number 9, that the intention is not for us to damage the forests and the wetlands to fix the atmosphere. We're not about moving the problem from one place to another. It's about doing both sustainably. Our forests and wetlands provide clean air, habitats, livelihoods, soil stability, medicine, just to mention a few. We can't afford to lose that. So sustainability must be core to greenhouse gas removal. And I don't think this comes to as a surprise to any of you. So in summary, wrapping up, I take you to slide number 10. We have 5 key elements to chase after here. First, like all good things, it's to acknowledge you've got a problem. There is too much CO2 in the atmosphere. We need to slow emissions and start removals. It's acknowledging the problem. Second is to look at the wide range of opportunities we have and continue to develop a broad range of greenhouse gas removal solutions, all the way from rocks to forests and all the knock-ons that they bring. The third one is to acknowledge we're going to have a heavy reliance upon trees and forests and biomass. So to start now to secure fair, potentially international deals to ensure a long-term access to sustainable forests, plants, and wetlands. We need to have a place to put all that CO2. So the fourth thing we need to do is launch and grow an extensive carbon capture and storage network. It is already starting around the world. The UK has a good lead, but has not yet executed one of these. It needs to start soon. And the final piece in the summary is the recognition of how much we need to do. 50 million tons of CO2 in 2050 is a lot, and we need to start now if we're going to get to that level. So, Sarah, I wrap up at this point, and I look forward to taking questions. Thank you.
So that's all for today. Thank you very much for listening to the live stream. We hope that you've enjoyed it.